Hello. A couple of you shared that you're feeling a little bit intimidated by the second task on the Hamlet section of the examination paper. So I just want to talk you through it so that you feel a little bit more comfortable, because whilst it does seem to be asking you to use perhaps some newer skills or older skills in a new combination, it's actually relatively straightforward. So I'm going to talk you through how it's straightforward today, and hopefully that will make you feel a little bit better. So here's an example of a question which was in the pack that I shared with you on task B. And I just broke down for you here, and I'm doing it again visually, how the question is put together. So at the top, you'll always get a steer, which is like a quote. It's not acknowledged where it comes from, and you have to respond to that quote. And it's a little bit like the A Doll's House Paradise Lost question, or if you're looking at the Gothic, the Dracula Bloody Chamber, or the American, that's the Age of Innocence question. You have a steer, you have to respond to it. So that's nothing new for us. Underneath it, you're asked to do a couple of different things. So underneath this steer, we've got using your knowledge of the play as a whole, show how far you agree with this view of relationships between generations in the play Hamlet. So this little piece of information is very useful. It tells us a couple of things. It tells us that we have to use our knowledge of the play as a whole, which could include like quotes, or it could be if we don't remember quotes from a bit that we know is really, really pertinent to that particular topic. It could be references to specific scenes or events from the play. Ideally, it would be quotes because the mark scheme looks for detail, but it doesn't have to be. If you've got a great point, don't omit it because you don't remember specific quotes. You're also asked to think about how far you agree with that statement. So it's an invitation to share your specific views. So they need to be included. You also get a really helpful key phrase that I've highlighted in yellow here. So if you don't really get the steer, so the quotation on the top is a little bit tricky or a little bit obscure, look at the phrase in the statement beneath it, and that will help you to decode it a little bit. So this quote talks about intergenerational conflict. What does that mean? Well, underneath it, we've got this helpful phrase, relationships between generations. So if we know the word conflict, and we know that this is about what are the relationships like between generations? Are they full of conflict or not? Do we think that that provokes much of the play's tension? That's what we're being asked to look at here. You're then given a reminder to support your answers with references to different interpretations of the text. So you shouldn't just be saying what you think, you should be thinking about what other people think too. I'm going to, in a second, break down in a little bit more detail what others' views are, and that might be able to help you a little bit. So there's a mark scheme on this slide, and I'm now just going to talk you through that. And I'm going to keep it super simple to make it nice and clear for you. So for this question, you are assessed on AO1 and AO5, which is a bit of a peculiar combination. We've been assessed on AO5 before because we have to include views shared by others on like A Doll's House and Paradise Lost, for example, but also in your comparative essay on the contextual examination paper. We've done that before, but perhaps never exclusively in combination with AO1. If I was going to boil these assessment objectives down to something really, really straightforward, this is what you're being asked to do. AO1 equals use your knowledge of Hamlet to share what you think about the opinion provided. That's what AO1 really means. AO5 is to evaluate what other people might think or have thought of the opinion provided. So you want to think about what people are saying now, what people might have thought or said in the past. So you are looking to try and provide a kind of scope of those opinions if you possibly can. And believe me when I say that's actually easier than you think it is. So I'll come to a little bit in a bit more detail how we can achieve AO5 with relative ease a little further along in this video. But if I was going to boil down AO1 and AO5, that's what they mean. When we look at a response and we're trying to assess if we've actually met the criteria, AO1 would look like your ability to use quotations from the play. If you can't remember quotations from a specific scene that you desperately want to refer to, I would expect you to allude to specific things that happen within the play. AO1 can incorporate consideration of Shakespeare's methods, consideration of Shakespeare's use of genre conventions, developed arguments. So in simple terms, we're looking at longer paragraphs. Don't just drop in a couple of sentences and move swiftly on. It is about developing your ideas as much as you can. And it's also about addressing concepts that you've managed to study over the course of the play. So can you talk about existentialism or stoicism? And if you can, try and use that kind of elevated vocabulary to make your essay sound as academic as you possibly can. And in simple terms, that's what AO1 looks like when we write it out. AO5 can look really different, actually. So there are lots of different ways to include other people's opinions on Hamlet. It could include the embedding of critical perspectives. And I know for a fact that quite a lot of my class have got revision cards that they've been studying, trying to memorise some of the things that people have said about Hamlet over time. But it doesn't just have to be that method. There are other ways of including other people's views on Hamlet. So, for example, you can allude to different performed interpretations. And what's brilliant about that is that if you refer to an interpretation, like, for example, Laurence Olivier, that's an older interpretation than perhaps the RSC version with Papa Asidu. So by looking at different performed interpretations, we are able to look at different versions of the play over time. You can also consider schools of thought, and this doesn't have to be an explicit critical perspective. You can, for example, open up a paragraph that states a Marxist perspective on this subject might include, a feminist perspective on this subject might include. In simple terms, we can also just think about how a modern reader feels about a scene and how the contemporary audience at the time of Shakespeare's initial performance might have felt about that specific subject. So there's loads of different ways that we can include AO5. So what do you do when you're in the examination and you've got the question in front of you? It's a little bit intimidating, so let's break it down into a kind of process approach, bit by bit, and we'll eventually get to the stage where we can, quite confidently write this up. So the first thing to do is to certainly highlight the question, if not annotate the question. Now, your annotations don't have to be as detailed as mine, because it's more about setting yourself up with a bit of a success criteria. Okay, the question actually has in it a tick list of everything that you need to include in your response. So let's have a look at how it's constructed. And this is one of the questions which was on the Task B pack that I put together for you. So I know a couple of you have actually already had a go at this question. And if you haven't, then this video will probably set you up to do a really good job of it. So we've got here, betrayal is the norm in Hamlet, loyalty is rare. Using your knowledge of the play as a whole, show how far you agree with this view of loyalty in the play Hamlet. Remember to support your answer with reference to different interpretations of the text. So far, that seems pretty straightforward. The first thing you will see is that you've got that steer, which is the comment that you have to respond to, but also just underneath it, you've got a helpful phrase that enables you to understand it if you didn't on first reading. So we know that this is a question about loyalty and betrayal. So loyalty and its opposite, which is betrayal. The next thing that I spot in this question is that I have to use my knowledge of the play as a whole. And what that means is I need to either include quotes or I need to refer to specific scenes from Hamlet. Ideally quotes, if not, references to specific scenes. The next thing that I know I need to do is I need to share my opinions. So those should be absolutely clear. I mean, don't be worrying too much about avoiding I. It's a bit of a misnomer that you have to do that. It's more important that your views are clear than anything else. The other information that you're given is that you have to remember to support your ideas with reference to different interpretations of the text. So that's just reminding us to include other perspectives, which, as I've already shared, Doesn't have to be critical perspectives. It's just got to be different interpretations. So like a performed version is an interpretation, isn't it? And an interpretation of the play might be the one that's made when it's first performed, the one that's made when we go and see it in like 2016. So other perspectives is just a reminder there to back up your views, or to evaluate your views, should I say, with other interpretations. So the first thing you do is you annotate the question. You don't have to include all of this detail, but you damn well have to highlight what the question is about. Because if you don't, you will be kicking yourself if you then find on your proofread with 5 minutes to go in the exam, you've not really answered what it was asking for you to respond to. So it's very important that you do make sure you've looked at that steer and you look at the phrase underneath that helps you to understand it. Now, if you want to, you can always put yourself a little, like a box next to each of these things to tick off after you finish writing to create yourself a success criteria. That's especially good if you know you sometimes miss things out, but you don't have to. That's just one approach. So I want to talk to you about how I would go about planning this particular response. And it's my preference for this particular task to begin with AO1, just because then I know I start with the thing that I feel most confident with, which is my own view. And I hope that you do find that your views become quite quickly apparent as soon as you look at the question. And I do find that it's slightly more natural for me, but you might feel different. I know that other students in my class, for example, prefer to begin with critical perspectives. So I would look at that question, and the first thing I'd think of when I'm planning is, can I think of any examples in a play where that is true? Can I think of any moments in the play where that is patently false? And that's where I'm going to start. Very straightforward. And the first thing that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about betrayal and loyalty is Gertrude, because I know that that's something that Hamlet really cares about. He feels like he's been betrayed by his mother. He feels like his mother betrayed his father in order to get into bed with his uncle. So the first thing that comes to my head is those really quick, short quotations that exemplify my ideas. So I know that Gertrude's betrayal is against the warlike Hamlet. She jumps into those incestuous sheets, and it's argued that she does so for the gifts that Claudius places in her lap as a result. So there's a sort of superficiality, almost a sort of naivety to Gertrude. There's a salaciousness, sensuality to Gertrude, and I can talk about that with those particular pieces of evidence. But next, I want to start to kind of get into a discussion with the interpretations that have come before me or which are concurrent to my own views. And the first thing that comes to mind isn't even a quote. I don't need a quote for this. I can allude to the fact that in Lindsay Turner's production, which is the one that Benedict Cumberbatch starred in, they cast Gertrude much younger. And as a result of doing that, it makes much more sense for us to see Gertrude's act of betrayal in a more sympathetic light. And therefore, that's a good thing to refer to. I can bring that into my discussion. But let's say I want to develop that, and I do, because I want to get good marks at AO1. But I don't know any critical perspectives for Gertrude. Oh no, well, what do? I can think about different ways to read the text. And, you know, when I'm looking at a character like Gertrude, I want to bring in some Freud. And a Freudian reading, especially if I can remember that quote from Claudius, "Sometimes sister, now our queen," is really useful, because Freud argues that the reason why Hamlet doesn't immediately seek revenge is because Claudius, in getting into bed with his sometime sister, is merely manifesting Hamlet's desire, his repressed desire to get into bed with his mother. So Hamlet's repressed desire means that he betrays his father initially by not acting quickly enough. So I can, you know, bring in some other acts of betrayal through a Freudian reading. And I hope you've noticed in this plan for my first paragraph, I've not got any critical perspectives in there, and I'm not worried about it because I've got two different interpretations, and I know that I can provide quite a nice detailed and developed response there. And I know I'm going to bring in lots of interesting concepts. I've got my quotes to support it. So I'm really kind of driving my argument with my own views, and I'm holding a mirror up to them by looking at performances and by considering Freudian readings. But one paragraph is not enough, so I do need to plan a little bit more. So I do want to tackle the whole betrayal is the norm, loyalty is rare. So I want to bring in a little bit of loyalty if I can to give myself the kind of full scope of the response. And the character that comes to mind when I think about loyalty is probably Horatio. And if I'm looking at Horatio, I could also look at Hamlet's other friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So Horatio is loyal, and Hamlet holds him in my heart of hearts. That's a really easy quote to remember because it's got that repetition in it. And Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are unfortunately under the kind of cosh of Claudius. They are acting for the dread pleasures of Claudius, and they're only willing to offer to Hamlet their presence and their practices. And that verb there, practices, certainly implies a level of manipulation as opposed to support and friendship. So I've got two sets of characters there who are both friends for Hamlet. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern betray him, and Horatio is loyal to him. So I know I can really hit the full scope of the question there, and I'm starting with my own knowledge because that's where I feel most comfortable. Next, I want to evaluate that by looking at different interpretations. And let's say at this point I've not remembered any critical perspectives, but I'm not going to worry because I can bring in some context. Now, I'm not marked on AO3 here, but referring to a text and linking the text to the world that it comes from is called making a new historicist reading. So as long as I open up my interpretation with a phrase like a new historicist would acknowledge, then I know that I can bring in the fact that, I don't know, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern don't want to go against Claudius's word because in the context of the world that this is set, that would be an act of treason. So that's something that's influencing their ability to be loyal or their decision to betray Hamlet. If I wanted to, because I know that there's some power play going on between Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Claudius, I could talk about the power dynamic, and that's a Marxist reading. A Marxist would look at this text, they'd look at the relationships, and then acknowledge where the status is and the influence that that status has over the behaviours of other characters. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are essentially in a position of oppression. They are being forced to act the way that they are because otherwise there will be sanctions upon them. So I can talk about the power dynamic and I could bring in a Marxist reading. Well, let's say getting to, think about Horatio and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, I eventually, when I'm planning, remember a critical perspective. And I think this one's great if you can remember it too. Niccolo Machiavelli, I bet you guys have all been talking about Machiavellianism in the course of the play. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote the discourses, and in there he says that men are driven by two principal impulses, either by love or by fear. Machiavelli is an incredibly important Renaissance writer from Italy. He is writing quite a considerable time before Shakespeare, but because of the lack of, the internet and things, it takes a while for the Renaissance to spread through Europe to England. And as a result, Machiavelli is really influential. And we can see here, from my perspective, again, I agree with Machiavelli. I think that Horatio is driven by the principal impulse of love, and I think that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are driven by the principal impulse of fear, and that is why they betray Hamlet. It's not because they don't like him, it's because they are really heavily influenced by Claudius. They're frightened of him. I mean, that's kind of implied by the adjective dread, right? So I come to the critical perspective last there after I've kind of gone through my own thought processes. I want to acknowledge that some of you don't approach this task in the same way that I do. And I know for a fact that some students like to do what is known as like a knowledge dump. And you just get down on paper the critical perspectives that you know that are relevant to this question. So say, for example, I look at this question and the first critical perspective that pops into my mind is this one. It's that Polonius is a bad parent, and that's Pennington on Polonius. Now, so many of my students like to use that critical perspective because it's short and it's really easy to remember. I find it a bit tricky to start with a critical perspective because it means I have to work back to my own thoughts. But if you find that relatively easy, then that's okay. And I definitely can use this critical perspective to form a view on betrayal and loyalty in Hamlet. I just have to work backwards instead of forwards. Backwards to my own view. Yeah, that's how I envision this process anyway. So once I've got my critical perspective that I've remembered and I've popped it on the page, I have to make sure I can link it to the question, okay? There's no point in using a critical perspective that you remember, great, unless it is relevant, like it's not going to have any value for you. So this quote doesn't, ostensibly on the surface appear to connect with the idea of betrayal and loyalty, but it does if I think about it in relation to who he is being a bad parent to. So I could argue that through the course of the play, Polonius seems to be more loyal to the state than he is to his family. And I can start to think about how. How is he not loyal to his family and more loyal to the state? And the best way of thinking about that is the way he uses Ophelia. She's like a pawn in a chess game. She's a weapon, and I love this quote for using when thinking about Ophelia. He says, I'll loose my daughter to him. Like she's an arrow, she's weaponized, she's objectified, and she's something he can use to attack a potential aggressor to the state, Hamlet. So I can definitely use this, but in my plan, if I'm starting with the critical perspective, I absolutely have to make sure I know how it works with the question. So, I mean, I can develop this. I can go into thinking about that repetition of this phrase that happens a couple of times in the play. He talks about being behind the arras on 2 occasions. Twice he says, right, I'll just go and hide behind the curtain and spy on people. And it totally normalizes this idea of espionage. And as a result, I could probably bring in, again, Lindsay Turner's idea of transgenerational trauma. I just love that idea. And this idea that perhaps Polonius is suffering from living underneath the rule of that warlike Hamlet who made everything about ensuring that Denmark is the most aggressive and powerful state in the localized area. And so perhaps from that, he has got this idea that espionage and spying is totally normal. And certainly people have suggested that he's got a bit of PTSD. Do you notice how sometimes his kind of language trails off? You've got some ellipses. He uses false starts. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So someone somewhere has suggested he's got PTSD, and in an examination context, I don't remember who said that, but I'm not going to panic because I know that I'm still going to be able to incorporate other people's views. So I'm just going to say a modern interpretation of this presentation of Polonius would argue that his betrayal of his family is just PTSD from being an individual living under the yoke of a warlike king. So I know I've rambled and I'm sorry. I've tried to show you there how I would go about planning, and it is my preference to start with AO1 and then evaluate with AO5. But I know that some people like to start with AO5 and then consider their own views secondarily. Doesn't matter which one you do, they're both completely valid. But I just want to show you how I would plan and the depth of planning that I would do. And believe me when I say this, I'll bash together quite quickly. And you'll notice there's no really long quotations in there. I don't need to know them. And there isn't any really long critical perspectives in there. I don't need to know those. I've focused on what I do know, and what I don't know, I'm not worrying about. Having planned your response, the next thing to do is to decide how you're going to open your essay. You want to write a pretty succinct and clear introduction that's actually going to establish for you a roadmap for how you want the essay then to kind of progress afterwards. So this is what I do. I've got my plan. What are the key ideas that have come out for me whilst I've been planning? And this is what I think are my key ideas. So I think that there is a conflict between loyalty to family and loyalty to the state. I think that friendship and power have an influence on your ability to be loyal or whether you're likely to betray people. I think that people are more likely to feel the pain of betrayal when it is undertaken by somebody who we're close to, like, for example, family. So I've just whacked on this side here what my ideas are. So just literally the words and phrases. And these are going to be the kind of key points that I make in my introduction. The introduction is just that. It is just an introduction to my ideas. I don't have to write in any great detail. I just have to set out my stall for what I'm going to then go on to talk about. So this is the introduction that I formed on the basis of my plan. And you can see that all my ideas have come from my plan. Acts of betrayal proliferate in Hamlet, and loyalty does indeed seem rare. So I've already shown my opinion on that sphere, the quote at the top of the question. Frequently, characters experience conflict, negotiating their loyalties to lovers, friends, to their children, their country, and to their king. So I've just hit in that list all of the different topics that I'm going to cover in the course of the essay. Betrayal, Shakespeare suggests, is an inevitable part of the human experience and a dramatic part of the theatrical experience. So I've tried to evaluate a little bit again there. I've tried to think about the purpose of using betrayal or what Shakespeare might be trying to suggest broadly. It's quite a holistic point that I'm making, and I'm going to be much more detailed when I go into my analysis, which is what's going to come next. So I'm just going to show you one example of how I turn my plan into a paragraph. So you can see on the right hand side of the slide here that I've got the plan for my first paragraph. I've got a couple of quotes, I've got a couple of ideas for different interpretations, and you can see here that those three ideas have formed the three colour-coded sections in this paragraph. This is not perfect. I've literally just bashed it out very quickly. It's taken me about 8 minutes. And as a result, it's probably not the best piece of writing you're ever going to read. But what it does do is it shows you that that plan can quite easily become much more detailed in the process of writing it up. The plan is not the final production, as it were. It just gives you a kind of sense of where you're going to go. So you know you're not going to go massively off topic. So here's my writing. Perhaps the most painful experience of betrayal from the protagonist Hamlet's perspective is that of Gertrude. The Queen seemingly betrays her marital loyalty to Hamlet's father to post into incestuous sheets with her husband's brother, who charms her with his apparent devotion, manifesting in the form of delightful gifts. Such superficial and salacious behaviour seems indefensible through Hamlet's eyes, yet not so for all interpreters of the play. An alternative view of Gertrude's disloyal characterization is apparent in Lindsay Turner's staging of the play. Herein, Gertrude was, I've written as, was cast unusually young. This dramaturgical choice reasons that for Gertrude, who has borne a child to a warlike king with a startling propensity for frivolous acts of violence, as demonstrated through his thoughtless bet with Norway, it would be an act of loyalty to herself to marry for affection and for pleasure. Whilst Gertrude's choice to marry Claudius makes more sense and seems less offensive in Turner's production, a Freudian reading of this marriage would reveal the betrayal it causes as a consequence. Claudius marries Gertrude, quote, his sometime sister, now his wife, and in so doing manifests the repressed incestuous desires of Hamlet. Freud argues that it is because of Hamlet's unconscious desire for his mother he sees Claudius too readily as himself, and this prevents him from carrying out the wishes of his father, and as such sees him betray those father's wishes for much of the play. It's only when Gertrude dies and that connection is broken that he can act out of loyalty to his father and seek revenge. So, after analysing the actions of Gertrude, we can clearly see that whilst loyalty is evidenced in glimmers during Hamlet, the main course of its narrative seems a cycle of betrayals. So I'm not saying this is perfect, but what I am showing you here is that I've got quite a developed response purely from that quite simple plan. As soon as you've got like a well-structured plan that gives you the liberty to develop, to add in ideas as they arise for you. And also I've added in my kind of my terminology here. So I've referred to dramaturgical choices. I've referred to characterization. There's not loads of linguistic analysis or anything in here, but there is terminology, protagonist, for example, hero. And this means that I'm hitting all of my AOs, and the plan has really enabled me to do that. So one thing you can do if you want to do some revision on this particular question, you can use my plans for the rest of this question. So I've got paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 still to write here. There's no point in me writing all of this up for you. I think it would be worthwhile seeing how you would work with a plan that's structured in this way. Maybe have a go at pausing the video. Can you write up the second paragraph? Can you write up the third? So if you want to have a go at that, that would be a really great revision tactic. And also that would hopefully empower you then to look at another one of the questions from the same pack that I shared with you, which I think I'll put at the end of this video, and perhaps plan your own. And genuinely, I would advise planning as a really great revision tactic. You don't have to purely write essays to revise. Sometimes planning enables you to see the gaps in your knowledge, and it also enables you to get better at examination processes. So I talked about, look, if you don't know what a critical perspective is, or you don't have a critical perspective for the particular question that you are given in the examination, you can refer to schools of thought. And as long as you know what the viewpoints of a particular school of thought are, then you can use these phrases to enable you to access AO5 marks. So you can see here, I've given you a sequence of 5 sentence openings, which would help you to include an evaluative comment on how a feminist, new historicist, neoclassical, Marxist, romantic, critical writer might talk about Hamlet. So perhaps a modern feminist view of this would be that from a neoclassical perspective, we may see that. You can also see in all of these examples, I've underlined a few phrases, potentially, perhaps, may, could, seem. These are all kind of tentative phrasing, and they do make you sound quite academic, so it's always a good idea to try and write like this if you can. Of course, if you do know a critical perspective that's relevant to the question, you should absolutely use it. And in my plan, I included the critical perspective derived from Niccolo Machiavelli. On this slide, you should see, and again, this is in your pack for question B, task B, should I say, there are ways of including critical perspectives, even if you've forgotten their name or you've forgotten the exact phrasing of their quotation. So I'd encourage you, if you are the kind of person who forgets that kind of detail, to just pause this video here and have a look at the 3 examples for the ways you could phrase the inclusion of a critical perspective. The best version, the not bad version, and don't worry, I forgot the name and everything, but I'm still going to paraphrase and try and include a different viewpoint version. Certainly, one thing that I find students often forget to do is evaluate their critical perspectives. And one way to remind yourself to do that is to always follow up your critical perspective with either indeed, if you agree with it, or however, if you don't. So here's a good example. As the great Renaissance philosopher Machiavelli observed, Men are driven by two principal impulses, either by love or by fear. Indeed, Horatio's position in Hamlet's heart evidences his motivation for loyalty to be the principal impulse of love. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, however, are motivated by the principal impulse of fear. Fear of Claudius and his dread power, fear of treason, fear that their own inferior status makes them vulnerable to sanctions should they fail in the king's wishes, whatever friendship and loyalty his demands cost them. So you can see there, by including the word indeed after the critical perspective, I force myself to explain why I agree with it. I imagine by this point there is going to be a few people who have watched this video and are thinking, yes, this is all very well, but what if I don't know what those schools of thought are? Or what if I haven't watched Hamlet all the way through? And if that's the situation you are in, I would encourage you just to do something about it. So if you don't know critical perspectives on Hamlet, make some flashcards with the critical perspectives on them and get testing. Ask mum, ask dad, ask your dog, whatever it takes. Get yourself tested and you'll eventually learn them. If you don't know different schools of thought or different approaches to Hamlet, there is a document on that which is available on Teams. If you don't know how different directors and actors have interpreted the play on stage, there'll be lots of notes on that in your lesson notes from your studying of Hamlet, but also the Globe Player and digitaltheatre.com have a range of different productions of Hamlet. Why not over Easter watch one all the way through and make some really detailed notes? There are also filmed versions of Hamlet. I know for a fact that on DVD you can get Laurence Olivier's version and Kenneth Branagh's version, and indeed Zeffirelli's version starring Mel Gibson if that's something you're interested in. So there's lots of opportunities out there for you to develop a little bit more depth in your knowledge that you can apply to the play. So if you are feeling a little bit concerned, don't worry about it, just do something about it, and that will automatically make you feel a lot better. So I promised at the end that I would pop on the slide here a sequence of other task keys if you want to have a go at those and practice your planning skills. Then please do so, take a screenshot or just pause and make a note. But here are four different tasks that you can have a go at if you wanted to. And I hope this video has helped you. It's helped you think about how you would approach the task. It's helped you think about what you need to do to revise. And if it's done either of those things, then, it's worthwhile. All right, thanks.